I want to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me to moderate this important panel discussion. I'd like to thank Mario, who pours every ounce of energy he has into this initiative, and who, through thoughtful dialogue, is helping to shed light on environmental topics, sometimes uncomfortable ones, but nonetheless, they affect us all. Climate change should be void of politics. It should be guided by the scientific method, the same method that many of us apply when conducting our own research. In my opinion, the politicization of climate problems that have come to view over the past decades has contributed to sometimes a hostile debate that should not have been the case. And I believe that this forum serves as an example for the nation on how parties from all sides of the debate can come together to discuss these important issues in a cordial manner, and if necessary, agree to disagree respectfully. Through debate comes enlightenment. Through enlightenment, basically comes thought, and which leads to meaningful and pragmatic answers. And I believe everyone in this panel here today is looking for honest, pragmatic answers to the question at hand here. When we entrench ourselves in our beliefs, then we see things through the prism of our established truth. And we're probably more prone to failure. So we cannot afford to fail at this time because, generations depend on the actions that we take today. So our panelists today have a vast amount of wealth on international climate finance, the ongoing debate on who should finance projects involving renewable energies, whether solar or wind, should be at the forefront of many stakeholders. And one of our panelists today actually mentioned to me that governments are sometimes weary of financing such projects in developing regions, since it may be considered by some as a quiet acknowledgement of guilt. And that was something that was shared with me, right? So I want to introduce the panelists. We have Richard Morrison from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Yeah. Eugene Montoya from Waterfront Alliance. We have Silvio Pupo, who's actually a VoLo Foundation Fellow here at FIU and great organization. And we have Henrique Schneider from Switzerland, who we're honored to have here from the Swiss Federation of Small and Medium-Sized Businesses, and also a member of the Swiss Delegation to the Climate. So Henrique, I'm going to start with you. Your research covers the controversial topic of loss and damage. You've mentioned that communities often lack the resources to implement effective adaptation options. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the topic and discuss with us also the fund that has been created to meet such challenges?
Gladly. I have a presentation, and I trust that somehow the presentation is going to make it up there. I also trust that the presentation is going to be a nightmare. Not for me, but for you. I enjoy inflicting nightmares upon people. Because loss and damage is something relatively new. And last year I was trying to write a paper explaining what it is, and that paper was reviewed, for example, by Richard, and he was always very nice in his constructive remarks, but at the bottom of it all, the question was always, what the hell is this? Well, opaqueness is built into loss and damage. The second reason for this thing here being a nightmare for you is I'm an economist. I care about asking questions. I don't care about responding them. So for me, it's very good if anything comes up that comes up with new questions. So I'm talking here primarily from the perspective of a negotiator to the international climate process. Sometimes Switzerland, my home country, tasks me with negotiating stuff, and the negotiation of loss and damage is something that happened to me in the last 2 years. So, what is loss and damage? Next slide, please. We don't know. It's a general term used in negotiations to describe any damages in money that cannot be absorbed by adaptation. So the idea is here that you have some cost which goes beyond adapting to climate change. It's a cost incurred due to some major negative event. For example, flooding, for example, hurricanes. The standpoint of the negotiation is you cannot easily adapt to that. It goes beyond adaptation. So we don't know what it is, but we still decided to create a fund to deal with it. There is operationalization without definition, so every lawyer in the room should be panicking right now. Next slide, please. What counts as loss and damage? The answer is we don't know. We don't know because what we have in the negotiation language is a lot of examples. I copied in this slide, if anyone is interested, I can share the slide with everyone. I copied from the submissions by parties to the Conference of Parties of the United Nations of what they consider examples of loss and damage. It's important, it's really important to say this. It's not, there is no, it's a political discussion. So no one in the room gets up and said, no, this is not loss and damage. It's just several parties putting their views about what could count or not as loss and damage. So these examples are all indicative. Sometimes we have economic examples, like the loss of infrastructure, property, supply chain disruption, the loss of farmland, hunger, any other natural landscapes. And then we also have non-economic examples, like losses of family members, losses in culture, ways of living. It's in many submissions by parties, ways of living, traumata, and also migration. Keep in mind, again, I'm not saying that I agree with that. I'm just saying these are the views voiced by parties, what could be in loss and damage. The next slide, please. All these examples I gave you for negotiators like me used to the usual separation of adaptation, mitigation, it's very difficult to find out what is the relationship of these examples I just gave you to these adaptations and mitigations. So what is the relationship? Again, we don't know. We don't know because we never discussed so far with the content of the whole thing. So the idea is that loss and damage is some additional quality. Sometimes mitigation is not ambitious enough. Ambition is a big negotiation language point. However, of course, it's not defined what it is. But when mitigation is not ambitious enough, and when adaptation is impossible or cannot be successfully implemented by communities, then apparently when these two things are fulfilled, and mitigation not ambitious enough, and adaptation cannot be successfully implemented by communities, then we are talking about loss and damage. The successful implementation of adaptation plans is an important point because it says that loss and damage depends on circumstance. For example, all the coastline projects that you have here in Florida count as adaptation. Why? Because it's accessible to you. No matter how much it costs, it's accessible to you. Similar projects would not be adaptation, for example, in Namibia. Why? Because it's not accessible for them. Who draws the line? We don't know yet. Also, there are discussions in these negotiations about the so-called hard stops and soft stops, or the hard limits and soft limits. Soft limits would be, yes, you could adapt, but probably it's too complicated for you to adapt for that, so it's better to be paid after some catastrophic event instead of adapting to it and try to mitigate. What do we know about loss and damage? Next slide, please. It has been part of an epic discussion predating the United Nations framework on climate change, because the UNFCCC surfaced in 92. Loss and damage surfaced in 91. It was the first time the country, Vanuatu, mentioned it in a plenary. And then it took these countries a lot of time to get that on the agenda. It was 2013. 2013 that loss and damage was first mentioned in the decision. No one knew what that meant at that time. But 10 years later, in Sharm el-Sheikh, some of Mario was there. In 2013 and 2023 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, there was finally a decision to create a fund about loss and damage. The decision never bothered defining what loss and damage is. The decision never bothered tasking anyone with developing methodologies for finding out or measuring loss and damage. The only decision there was, we need a fund. So we're going to pay for what is politically negotiated to be loss and damage. And that fund was set in operational mode by the last COP in Dubai. Next slide, please. This is again a slide about what we do know. Is it liability and compensation? Many lawyers, especially the so-called umbrella group in the negotiations, the umbrella group is a group comprised by the US, Canada, Russia, Japan, Australia. These countries, they are a little bit skeptical of the international negotiations under the UNFCCC. They were always very agitated by loss and damage being something like liability and compensation. And since we never discussed the concept of loss and damage in content in these negotiations, no one ever said no until in Egypt the answer no surfaced, because it is written into the decision that loss and damage is based on cooperation and facilitation and does not involve liability and compensation. So this should, at least for a moment, put Americans and Canadians and other people at ease. However, we know how easy it is to change negotiation decisions. Who pays? Next slide, please. That was Dubai's major move, is to mobilize pledges. And you know that pledges does not mean money, it's just a pledge. But at least, this is a moving post thing. The countries that pledged more was France. You see that they pledged over 108 million US dollar to this fund. The EU with another 27 million. The US with 17 and Canada with 11. So altogether we have 700 million US dollars in this fund. And again, what is this fund supposed to do? The answer is, we don't know. But there is a transitional mechanism, a group of people thinking about what could be projects under loss and damage. Next slide, please. And so the ideas that these people came in their first report to the climate conference was weather indexed crop insurances, rebuilding of critical infrastructure, humanitarian assistance, assistance for providing for basic amenities to those communities most moved by climate change, emergency cash transfers, microcredit, the help for displaced person, and the diversification of skills. If you think that this is a mixed bag, yes, it is, because it's not a technical, methodological decision of the climate conference, it's a political discourse. A bunch of parties came up and said, this is the list of things we want funded. And the list has been compiled. Now, let me come to my last slide, next slide, please, which is some thoughts that I have as an economist. And again, my thoughts means I have questions. I cannot answer. I don't even want to answer. So the concept is still open texture. There is no definition. There is only the operationalization. Probably an understanding will emerge, but it's a political understanding. It's a negotiated thing. It's not a technical thing. We have no idea how this fits into the Paris Agreement. How we will draw up the boundaries between mitigation and adaptation finance, which are the three parts of the Paris Agreement, and this new concept, we still don't know. We don't even know if it is really part of the Paris Agreement, which calls into questions how do we deal with double counting? This is a very technical term, but people like me, since 2015, we have been negotiating how to exclude double counting. And now we have a potential vector for new double counting. And again, what is the economic relationship between that and mitigation? And for an economist, it's an important thing, because mitigation costs upfront. And here you have a mechanism that pays you if you did not mitigate. There is an incentive problem built in it. But for every student interested in international negotiations, perseverance pays off. In 1991, they came up with the idea, and 30 years later, they got their fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Henrique. Henrique, I do have a follow-up question, since this is actually fresh on our minds right now. What is this about? No, I'm just kidding. No, the question is this. Obviously, lost and found is linked to calamities, and oftentimes calamities that for communities that are unable to adapt to these major changes. It seems to me that the pledges of 700 million in aggregate seem to be like a drop in the bucket, right? Because any one of these projects would be extremely costly. And I don't see any private, these are governments, I'm assuming, that have pledged this. There doesn't seem to be any private collaboration here as well. Is anything being done to try to include private industry to be part of this fund as well, especially companies that actually operate in areas of the world that, again, we go back to the liability issue, right? But especially companies that operate in areas that could perhaps be contributing to these changes?
The answer is yes and no.
That's my answer.
No, no, because the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC, it's a negotiation between countries. And countries are wary of including private sector for different reasons, especially for the reason of double counting. If Shell, to name some company, pays 100 million into the loss and damage fund, is it a claim of Shell or is it a claim of the Netherlands? We don't know that because, again, there is no methodology for doing that stuff. So this is the no part. The yes part is that in Dubai there was a distinct opening to the business sector to contribute in funds, but it was, as usual, a call, and a call without specifying how this would be considered.
Thank you so much. Richard, I'm going to move to you. And you've mentioned that there's a sort of three-legged stool that we should always keep in mind when we're dealing with climate-related issues. And that three-legged stool consists of finance and markets, which we're all familiar with, public policy and influence of politicians, and also the evolving state of the environmental science itself, right? You've also said that sometimes specialists from each one of these areas just work like in silos, and they're isolated from others, and that creates a problem, obviously, because sometimes there's no connection between the three. So you've also stated that certain crucial topics are not properly addressed, and climate finance expansion and broad-based net zero initiatives will likely fall short of their advocates' ambitions. Could you please tell us a little bit more about these topics and your thoughts on how we should address them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think things I want to cover are, three. This is a secondary three-legged stool.
Right, exactly.
But three topics here. This is the dependence of decarbonization technologies on government subsidies, current laws in the U.S., some of which have already been mentioned, that are getting in the way of U.S. clean tech leadership, and then the lack of focus in major industrial policy goals. And when it comes to a lot of climate finance stuff, that is a subset of industrial policy, even though we think of it as environmental policy. So public sector reliance, obviously most of the people who are involved in climate finance here are probably going to be lamenting the lack of a volume of climate finance. But I think, like any popular investing trend, the green tech and renewable energy sector faces a potential investing bubble in which we end up having too much capital trying to chase too few market opportunities. And you can compare this to, say, like the dot-com bubble of a quarter century ago, when for a while it was really easy to raise money for any startup as long as it had something to do with e-commerce, and so there's a lot of enthusiasm for green tech stuff that's similar to that. But increasingly, especially over the past few years, the big difference with climate tech is that so much of the enthusiasm and capital is coming from the government rather than the private sector. Mm-hmm. So between the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, we have hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, that's over 10 years, tax credits and other fiscal inducements, stimulating demand for electric vehicles, charging stations, solar panels, hydrogen fuels, and other technologies. At the same time, there was a PwC report out, got a lot of attention, that said total venture and private equity investment in climate technology fell by 50% in 2023. That's global, not US. So I think the dependence of climate-conscious technology on taxpayer subsidies is a problem, potentially for multiple reasons. First, is the very most basic one, is that capital that's allocated by politics rather than markets doesn't necessarily flow to what is best, what's cheapest, or what's most commercially promising, but to whatever makes it through the sort of sausage grinder of lobbying and the legislative process. And when we've seen this in other industries as well, when subsidies expire, if firms have planned their investments with those subsidies investments in mind, they're going to struggle to stay in business. So when subsidies for particular products and ones that are politically popular and industries flood into the economy and then they recede, potentially you could leave firms with stranded assets that are no longer profitable in the absence of incentives. So, that being said, we should want subsidies to expire eventually, right? And we know that the federal legislative and regulatory process is often slow. It's been described as sludgy and kind of lurching, rather than being smoothly responsive to changing market realities. And we found that sometimes once a provision makes it into law, it's more likely to be simply rolled over and renewed budget year to budget year, rather than being critically re-examined. And thus, even if we have technology-specific industrial environmental policy that was brilliantly and perfectly conceived at the outset, it could still end up becoming outdated over time. And I think to use an example here, historic and current example, the subsidies for ethanol production that we have on the books now are a good example of this scenario. Despite being chemically useful for certain purposes, ethanol has quite a few drawbacks in the way it's currently used. So it's less energy dense than gasoline itself. So vehicles powered with ethanol added gasoline get worse gas mileage, can damage engines, but much more importantly, diverting arable land from human food production to biofuels production can increase food costs, it can threaten global food security, and and burning higher ethanol blends can create even traditional air pollution problems separate from greenhouse gases. So, but of course, the long-term supporters of biofuel subsidies would claim that they create environmental benefits, right? There's a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But I think a lot of people have looked at the full sort of dynamic life cycle analysis of how biofuels are actually created and used, and I don't think that's true. So biofuels policies, among other things, draw additional land into agricultural production. So that means more fertilizers, insecticides, pesticides, and fossil-fueled farm machinery. All has to be transported. And when we look at all those, those dynamic land use changes, I think carbon dioxide emissions are actually higher than they would otherwise be because of ethanol use as a fuel additive, in addition to all its other problems with things like food security. So we have a set of environmental policies. With biofuels, we have both mandates and subsidies, really a double whammy. So they end up having both negative economic and environmental effects. And their results, I think, if you look at this from, Henry was saying, looking at it from maybe not a lawyer side, from the economist side, if you look at this from the political science side, you have, a classic case of interest group politics. You have rent seeking by producers. You have log rolling by politicians. That's where politicians trade favors and vote for each other's pet projects. You've got concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. And it's yielded a policy status quo that has become politically sacrosanct for reasons that have nothing to do with the environment, but delivers terrible results. So not great. And I think we want, if we're crafting, whether it's subsidy policies or any other kind of government policy that's relevant to climate finance. We want less of what looks like ethanol and more of whatever is the least like that. And since this is sort of an international focus, I think it's worth mentioning the large-scale industrial subsidies for climate tech, by the way, can also create international dysfunctions. The green energy funding and the BIL and the IRA was, of course, widely celebrated by climate policy advocates, but relatively little, I think, has been written about how that's straining relations with some of our closest allies who now have to offer equivalent inducements in order to have any hope of luring new green production facilities inside their own borders. There's a lot of international companies. They can locate lots of different places. They can choose different countries to make major investments in. And the IRA is acting like a gravity well, drawing them to the US and away from other countries who have their own climate goals and initiatives. And those other countries are having to compete with IRA-level subsidies with smaller economies and smaller government budgets. So, the European Union's entire, Green Deal industrial plan, which is, announced to a lot of fanfare, is itself largely a response to having to deal with the renewable energy credits that were in the IRA and sort of compete with them. But at least the EU has a GDP that's sort of relatively in the same league as the US. I think they're about 70% or so, US GDP. But those subsidies are also draining investments and talent, and something that's been complained about from countries like Canada. And Canada has like 1/12 of the GDP of the US. And asking Canadian taxpayers to develop Canada's green tech sector while having to compete with IRA-sized subsidies is going to be punitive for Canadian taxpayers if they try to do that. So number two is permitting roadblocks, which we've already had a little mention of. So the problem with infrastructure permitting and environmental laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, in particular at this point, has become a sort of frequent topic of discussion in the world of climate finance, and Professor Coleman got into that a little bit yesterday. And we've got similar problems, I think, with anti-nuclear bias in policymaking that makes it, NEPA makes it more difficult to build lots of big industrial things. There's anti-nuclear policy that also specifically have throttled nuclear development. And certainly we know that's the case in Germany and recently sort of the case in Spain as well. But the issue here is pretty straightforward. I think that in order to achieve major environmental goals regarding emissions reductions, major economies down the world are going to need to build and deploy a new significant volume of renewable and low emissions generating capacity and the transmission infrastructure to deliver that power where it's needed. But that process is slow and expensive, and it's much slower and more expensive than it needs to be, particularly in the United States. So both the federal environmental review process and state level laws, especially like in California that mimic it, are slowing down and blocking, not like coal-fired power plants, because we've already stopped building those. They're often blocking renewable and low-carbon infrastructure projects. So, and government stimulus, like we saw in the BIL, like we saw in the IRA, is going to come to naught to a certain extent if we don't widen the bottleneck that exists in permitting. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of political leaders in the president's current party and in a lot of environmental activist organizations who are willing to countenance any change. They don't want any significant statutory reform of NEPA or other environmental statutes. And the Biden administration, for example, has said that they repeatedly say they support permitting reform. Even the Obama administration, before it became such a big issue, had a report saying they support that. And the Council on Environmental Quality has proposed this new rule that's supposed to help with that. But unfortunately, I think some of what's in that proposal itself is actually going to make the situation worse. So finally, number three is everything bagel industrial policy is the third problem. So, we've had some attempts at process reform in the previous White House and the current one, though they sort of disagreed about what counts as good process reform, those two teams. But at the same time, we've seen a rise in another sort of problematic trend that I think could erode some of those positive effects if they actually, we do get them. And that's what columnist Ezra Klein described in the New York Times last year. He wrote a column called "The Problem with Everything Bagel Liberalism." I think he probably could call it everything bagel progressivism, not classical liberalism like our European friends that call themselves liberals. But that refers to this trend of forcing every major development to serve multiple, often conflicting goals. So that includes government projects as well as private projects that need, just like in the case of NEPA, that need government permission or financing. And that, that planning burden and sort of splintered focus ends up making all of these projects slower, more complicated, more expensive, and as a result, you get less of the desired outcome, which in this case usually is low emissions power. So one big example that's gotten a lot of comment is not environmental, but I think it's sort of the way this legislation works is kind of parallel. Different sort of environmental policies, the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies to support domestic the microchip manufacturing sector. And unfortunately, the Department of Commerce, which is implementing that, has decided to add a bunch of secondary burdens to the approval process besides just setting up a plant that makes microchips. So these are sort of nudges in which people applying for subsidies are gently encouraged to include these considerations. They want you to buy from U.S. suppliers. They want you to hire minority subcontractors, hire more female employees, and they have even some very specific expectations, like that you should build you should commit in advance to building on-site daycare if you're building a new chip fab. So those conditions, whatever you think about them as good or desirable outcomes, they're going to limit the ability of the legislation, like the CHIPS Act or any similar legislation, from being maximally successful as its ostensible purpose, which is getting a lot of chips the most for your money. And unfortunately, I think the current administration's climate finance policy suffers from some of these sort of splintered everything bagel problems. So the Council on Environmental Quality's proposal that's supposed to speed up permitting, the team that drafted it there sort of felt the need to include what I think are some novel progressive policy preferences that will end up slowing down the process. And it was Mark Miller and Isaiah McKinney at the Pacific Legal Foundation wrote about this recently, and they said the climate justice element that has now been was part of this. Expecting climate justice considerations to always be part of these permitting decisions, it actually dramatically expands the scope of the regulatory review and potentially introduces whole new categories of legal challenges, which of course was the entire point, which was the opposite of the point of the process, which is to constrain those and make the process faster. So just to wrap up, I think when it comes to the huge volume of finance money that is coming from the government for clean tech ventures, depending on government spending to drive an entire industry, unless perhaps it's the defense industry, I suppose, is probably an unsustainable mistake. A lot of capital and opportunity, I think, is probably going to get lost or misallocated, and producers will ultimately be chasing politically determined subsidy opportunities rather than what we normally do in the world of business, which is creating value for customers. Now, there is a strong and growing demand for technologies that lower greenhouse gas emissions, absolutely, both commercially and at the household level.
So it feels like politics are getting in the way to a certain extent, right? I mean, obviously, if the federal government would perhaps work closer with the private industry, many of these things may actually be mitigated, and there may be more financing opportunities, right, for these types of projects. And so that's but you're right. I mean, special interests in all areas, right, affect sometimes the bureaucracy itself can affect these important projects.
Well, yeah, and just
go ahead. Yes, and I want to move on to
wrap it up there. This is, a situation that's persisted for a long time, right? We've had the Department of Energy and other federal agencies have had subsidies for renewable energy for decades, back long before people even worried about climate change, when we were worried about energy conservation because of the Arab oil embargo and crisis. One of the economic arguments here is that this is the infant industry argument. This is an infant industry. It's struggling to get its feet off the ground, but all we need to do is give it a little incentive, and then it'll get out of the nest and it'll fly. The problem with a lot of infant industries is they never grow up. They're perpetual infants, and they've become so acclimatized to being subsidized, they never reach sort of takeoff capacity and become pure market phenomenon. But the other thing is, if you look around at big equity investments, what are the biggest firms? What are the most innovative firms? What are the most popular superstar firms? A lot of them aren't profitable, right? And so, it's on like book value, right? GAAP accounting principles. But people still dump a bunch of money into them. People still invest in them because they think that there is a great future of profitability, right? So the idea that clean tech startups, well, they're not profitable yet, so they have to have government subsidies. It's like, well, no one said that about a million other tech startups.
Right, right. Yeah,
Right.
and it leads back to the finance principle as far as valuation of equities, right? Which is we're really valuing the expected future cash flows that the companies will be generating. That's why you've had companies that have had negative earnings for X number of periods, quarters, and yet their valuations were actually significantly greater than book value just because of that. And you're saying that if we were to focus on the future and saying, hey, this is what we can actually get from this, the value is much greater than the simple book value that we can attribute to it at this point. I'm going to move on to you, Eugene. I want to ask you a question. Your topic on sea rise levels and water mitigations, but you also talk about natural capital and how it affects the climate, right? The climate finance success, right? So my question is, do you believe that in the short run, if there's a finite amount of this natural capital, but in the short run, if prices were to continue to rise, or they've been actually getting a little lower lately, but if they were to rise for traditional fossil fuels, will that bring some hurt in the short run, but eventually move us in a direction that's more sustainable, right? More renewable energy type.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just want to say thank you for inviting me to this conference. I think it's a really wonderful gathering of the minds. Just a little more context on myself. I've worked in financial services for over 20 years. I've spent the last 15 of those years focused on climate finance and trying to move money into climate solutions in responsible ways, ways that deliver financial, environmental, social returns. So really the triple bottom line to the extent that it exists or it's challenged. With respect to your question, I mean, natural capital is really a newer concept around accounting for natural resources. We have lots of names for what we already do with valuation. We have commodity markets, spot markets, futures markets. That's really how the built environment around us has been designed. And this is one of the reasons that the fossilization of our energy system is so challenging to undo, because we've really volumized it, consolidated it. We've created cities that are heated, cooled, and charged from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels themselves are a non-renewable resource that the Earth, has finite amounts of. But there are also renewable resources out there as well. They include things like hydrocarbons, water, minerals, land use, other kinds of natural assets. So as people start to think about natural capital and what it means for international climate finance, which, by the way, all climate finance is international because it comes from the legacy of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's about the global north and the global south. It's about discussing what caused climate change, who's responsible, and how are we going to adapt to it while we also try to turn off the faucet of emissions. Natural capital is helping people in the financial services industry understand the carbon profile of their investments across time horizons, ways to understand how much money I'm lending you or underwriting your equity or underwriting your debt, what you're doing with that money operationally, and how it's affecting the environment. The double materiality thing is focused on how do I harm the environment or damage it myself and the people who live in it, the built environments that grow up around it, or how is it affecting me? Sea level rise, heat stress, water stress, mineral scarcity. These things are measurable, they're relatable. We can have absolute numbers, we can have relative numbers. We can have stationary assets, we can have mobile assets. We can have stationary combustion of fuels, we can have mobile combustion of fuels. These things are well understood by engineers, but financial services has really taken, I'd say since about the 1980s, a very short-term view on capital. There's a focus on, I want to preserve my capital, I want exposure to the upside, I want revenues to keep building my wealth. Well, eventually, when you line up all of those transactions on a grid, they start to run out of room. They start to run out of runway. This is the reason that why some of our markets are actually failing us. It's probably not news to many of you, but the energy grid that we operate in the United States is on the border of collapse quite often. It's almost a miracle that we're able to translate coal and oil and gas into electrons that come into the end use that everyone is benefiting from. The mere fact is that these fuels are unsustainable. And so it's a balancing act now. How do we start to increase the renewability and the sustainability of our resources while figuring out how to manage down our reliance and our overdependence on finite resources? So going back to your question on this, I think that it requires having a view of your renewable and non-renewable natural capitals, how you use them, how you signal, and like you said, and I think you made it a great point, that when you buy equities, you're buying the future. When you buy debt, you're buying the past. And we can use the same principles of financial services and markets and infrastructure in the climate sense to understand how even an individual consumer can contribute to a larger climate goal, but corporates and commercial and industrial scale has even greater potential to completely change the way that we live with the environment and nature.
So basically, since it is a finite resource, even proponents of let's continue to use fossil fuels will have no choice but to adapt, and to start adapting now makes the most sense. Because obviously the resource will eventually, disappear, and new technologies will have to take over, right? I want to ask you all a question also. So my area of research is dealing with institutional investors, and Silvio, I'm going to get to you in a second as well. But I want to pose a question here. So my area of research is dealing with institutional investors and basically how they have adapted and how they've actually sponsor or support investments in these types of areas. And the ESG word for some is a bad word. Unfortunately, it is. It's just reality at this point. It was not. I feel like it's been politicized to an extent where oftentimes, if you even sputter those words, you'll have negative comments immediately after that. But my question is this: the research points towards a negative link, and this is the empirical research. It points to a negative link between ESG endeavors, projects, and institutional ownership at the firm level. So meaning that the more institutional investors, and these can be mutual fund managers, these can be other types of organizations, hedge funds, for example, the more control as far as the number of shares that they control in a specific firm, the lesser the level of ESG. And we see this around basically in all industries as far as the empirical research is concerned. So this leads to the area of greenwashing, right? So greenwashing, obviously, since there appears to be a lot of support from many stakeholders on investing in these types of projects. Even some research actually even suggests that investors are willing to accept lesser profits if they believe that the firm itself is conducting their policies accordingly as far as what they want them to do. But there's this area of greenwashing where you have a lot of institutional owners, meaning mutual funds, that perhaps are saying one thing, but not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're sort of making it a little bit fuzzy, it's a little bit subjective. So I'm going to start with you, Silvio, since I haven't asked you anything yet. What can we do, in your opinion, to mitigate this, basically to make sure that institutional investors that are proposing or actually following a specific mandate dealing with environmental issues are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, rather than just using it as like propaganda, right? Like a marketing piece. And I think I think that's an important question that faces, because if many of these mutual fund managers and hedge fund managers actually practice what they're preaching, or at least what they're promising many of the investors that are investing in these funds, then perhaps more capital can be flowing to these types of endeavors. So please share with me your thoughts on that. What could we do to ensure that there's a fair playing field here?
Well, that last part's a whole another part to unpack. So let's leave that. Let's leave that separate. But really, on the first part of what can institutional investors, just to rephrase the question.
What can, not institutional investors, what can investors do to make sure that the institutions that are actually following a fiduciary responsibility and doing what they're supposed to be doing as far as the mandate for their specific investments?
Yeah, so it's a complex answer. The thing that comes to mind is a little bit of thinking about this as an emerging asset class, really, and then some of the obstacles that we face. And actually, I was going to give a little presentation on this, but just for housekeeping, thank you so much, Flavio, for having me on the panel,
My
and
pleasure.
Mario for organizing this, and the VoLo Foundation for helping sponsor this event, and my fellowship to actually dig deeper into the work here, especially around natural capital assets. And when it comes to investability, right, there are a couple of ways to look at it. And one side, definitely ESG is almost like a bad word now. I think the last year during the symposium, we were able to really all agree that ESG has had the opposite effect, if anything, because of greenwash. But I think natural capital asset as an asset class can go in either direction as well. Some folks right now, for example, have been trying to figure out how do we even turn this into a properly investable instrument. You had a recent attempt by Intrinsic Exchange and New York Stock Exchange to propose a new type of publicly traded company called a natural asset company. So, and I believe that the government of the IDB and government in Costa Rica was seeking to kind of put part of their forest into its own company, and then have its like a public offering of that forest, so that others can invest into that. And what comes to mind when thinking about that is the difference between sort of offsetting and insetting when it comes to compliance on the corporate side, right? So you have either the corporate participants of stakeholders, and you have the investors that also need to kind of do their own set of compliance rules. ERISA rules, which is we were talking about, maybe the obligation of fiduciary duty in the U.S. anyway, from taking money from pension funds, comes up. It comes to mind when when Reuters article talking about the New York Stock Exchange pulling their natural asset company proposal recently, I think as soon as last month or the month before that, mentioned that one of the pension funds was like, well, if we put our assets into this company, maybe we'll have Chinese interest or Russian interest or somebody buy that stock and to try to control our land, our farmland, productive things. But I really believe that's a bogus, and this is more of an opinion, but I believe that's a little bogus because one of the things that's essential for natural asset companies to survive is the governance structure, right? That's going to be behind that company. You don't invest in any, you always look at the corporation and the corporate status and the board and everything else. Natural asset companies are no different. But especially, I would say that most of the stewards of natural capital assets, in 80% of cases, or 80% of natural assets out there, especially forests and wetlands and the kind of things that I'm really passionate about now and working on, are stewarded by indigenous communities, right? Which are 2% of the general global population. And so those indigenous communities are the ones that are the closest to, the conversation of loss and damage they're the closest to a lot of this, but also, either will benefit or be hurt the most. At the same time, I believe that those stewards that have already been stewards for thousands and thousands of years are probably going to continue administering those natural capital assets longer than a corporation might, right? I mean, they've already been doing it for thousands of years. What company has been around 1,000 years, right? So from that point of view, I would say there's two ways, right? One of them is, okay, what are the concerns in terms of maximum return on investment? Which I believe we're still the data science, the science behind digital monitoring, reporting, and verification standards that allow us to show those changes over time, and then link the changes in the biophysical sciences into economic translation. Really, there's a gap that everybody's trying to figure out there, and I love our sort of Swiss friends' way of talking about we don't know, right? I think that's very funny. We really don't know. The closest that we're moving in this direction, I think, to address some of this, especially in the terms of offsetting and insetting, whether you're on the asset manager side or you're the corporation, is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which we talked a little bit about last year, that TCFD. We're actually seeing Gary Gensler and others from the SEC are expecting by the end of March, so a couple of weeks from now, potentially to come out with some adoption of a similar rule that adopts climate accounting for at least carbon-centric focus, greenhouse gas focus for scope 1, 2, and 3, which is also another issue. So just like that is going to be unpacked, we can anticipate that in terms of natural capital assets, natural asset companies, the same will happen with another set of rules that's coming down from ISSB down, which is the central bank. For those of you who don't know, it's like the central bank of central banks. Is coming down the pipeline. Everybody's kind of now trying to align themselves through these different COPs. And so we're going to see TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is going to be focused on actually not nature, but biodiversity.
It's so fuzzy. It's so difficult to even police this.
Well, that's the idea of, I think, the work that we're doing here, right? Exactly, is that we'll be able to use open technology, open data, open standards, blockchain, AI, IoT, so that everybody is policing it. It's not going to be one government. It's not going to be the UN.
It has to be a community.
Kind of everybody will have to be responsible for that.
It has to be sort of like FINRA's oversight of the financial markets. But in my research, I've been working on a paper, and one of the things we've discovered, and it's a little bit disheartening, is that many of these institutions, and by that I'm referring to institutions that actually manage money, so they're actually investing in
asset managers
who have an ESG mandate, right?
Okay.
And what we've seen, and we were quite surprised to see this, is that initially, yes, they may invest in firms that actually have higher levels of engagement in ESG, yet they seem to just sit on that, and eventually, even if the actual ESG grade of a firm, as reported by many of the different providers of ESG data, decreases, they still seem to be holding these positions. So that's where the greenwashing, we believe, is taking place.
Well, which I believe is very different, right? I think that I don't think you can really greenwash investment in natural capital, right? It's a lot harder. It's a lot easier to greenwash ESG than it is to say, hey, I proved that I planted this tree. Hey, I proved that I planted this mangrove. Hey, I can prove I planted this coral, right? Hey, I can baseline the biodiversity that's going to change in this forest. Hey,
Yes. Yes, because we have to. So let's. Yes, go ahead.
So I do not see the difference between the two things. You said it's a very different thing to substantiate that you invested in natural capital as opposed to ESG, which you can greenwash. The ESG investments are in natural capital.
Not necessarily. I think it's still an emerging asset class. ESG is its own financial engineering and checkbox. I think it's more of like a checkbox thing than a biophysical sciences thing.
It might be useful to talk about like where ESG came from. It's a 2005 IFC paper. The multilateral banks in the post-World War II world have created development finance to support both emerging and developed countries rebuild and reconstitute. The multilateral world is the one that started to focus and realize as global North investors came into the global South, that there were a lot of social dimensions that had to be factored in informal economies in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. For that reason, environment, social, and governance, which really the governance part has become corporate governance, and that's how it's been utilized by Wall Street, by these labeled funds, by these climate bonds. That is really why you have this mishmash of different elements in one, return profile, and that's what's made it easy for labeling to become a way to be attacked by groups that are not interested in some of the ESG topics or issues like defossilization of the energy industry or others. But it's true that natural capital is a discipline to measure natural capital, carbon, water, land use, minerals. That is separate from ESG objectives, goals, mandates, how passive investors, active investors truly materialize these changes in the built and the physical world.
We have very little time left, like a minute or two left. So do we have any questions for the panelists? Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, there's a link. My direct answer would be I'm happy to share directly with you, and then we will maybe see if anybody what's gonna happen with the presentations after to get. But if anybody's interested, my email is going to be the last slide. if you want to put that up, and then you'll see you can just send me an email, and I'll go ahead. I'll just go ahead and look at we'll open up that last slide there. And then really what we're talking about was natural capital as an asset class, ecosystem services as a cash flow statement, and kind of what we can anticipate as an opportunity in Miami, for example, by adding these assets to our balance sheet. We could lower our debt, perhaps, right? Our debt yield and our yield, what kind of municipal debt. And this is kind of conversations I've been having with other leaders like Andy Fenichel at Yale University, which is a big, one of the leading economists on this topic in the US. There's really a handful, not a lot of folks that are a specialist, but my contact information is there. You can send me a text or send me an email, and I'll be happy to share more information and maybe even do a presentation on YouTube for folks to make this more digestible.
Silvio. Mario told me to be done by 11:45. It's 11:44, so we have one more question. Yes.
So, just a point of clarification, because it seems to have come up a little bit. In talking about climate finance and ESG and all these other terms, I have struggled myself in using the right terms to talk about the certain financial regimes or activities that are going on. When you look at the definition of climate finance that the Climate Convention has offered, it's very much all-encompassing, yet also it seems in practice to refer specifically to development projects in developing countries. So I was wondering if you could amongst yourself comment on like these are they specifically different things? Has there been clarity in what these terms refer to, or is it like an industry specific thing? Like, I don't know.
So whoever has a 1-minute answer.
Maybe I can start and then the finance guys can complement. The logic of the UNFCCC is to define things as it goes, or by inclusion. So you come up with some name like climate finance, and you leave it undefined. What you try to do is you try to mobilize specific mechanisms that fit under the target. And whatever mechanism has been decided in the decision to fit under the target is then considered an instantiation of climate finance. So we have climate finance. What does it mean? We have the Green Climate Fund. That is how you operationalize it. We have the Loss and Damage Fund. We have the Fund for the Least Developed Countries. And so you keep adding on this specific mechanisms under the label, and that's the way the UNFCCC operates with it, without offering a logical, all-encompassing, intentional definition.
Yeah, I think that's right, that climate finance is really, it breaks into 3 verticals. So mitigation, the net zero world, which again is about carbon and energy mostly, as well as other biotic processes. But adaptation resilience is a very small part of climate financial flows. Climate Policy Initiative does a great job of landscaping, showing you where all the public, private, and blended money is flowing into in terms of use of proceeds. And I think that the reason why adaptation resilience is so challenging is because it doesn't have a clean, neat accounting system the way carbon accounting or water accounting work. You don't have physical, legal definitions of units of analysis and measurement with things like how is this city withstanding the shocks of sea level rise, heat stress, what are the colonial implications of the global south with the global north investment, multinationals. So this is a reason why that area is defining and getting better defined through the loss and damage fund. But until new sort of accounting principles and standards will be developed, it'll continue to be a challenge to label something as adaptation finance or resilience
very gray
finance.
Borders.
Yes.
Very gray borders.
Super.
All right, thank you so much. The panel
Thank
is,
you.
for an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.